So I want to welcome all our panelists and the attendees who are joining us from, I think, like different parts of the world right now. Good afternoon, good morning. I guess it'll either be morning or evening, perhaps, but like good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are from. And I want to quickly just set out the idea behind today's panel. So recently, Vidhi, in collaboration with researchers from IIT Kharagpur and ICER, which are part of this TCG Crest Foundation, spearheaded by Professor Chakraborty, who's just joining us. We had come out with a paper in April, which was talking about the responsible use of artificial intelligence in the justice system. Now, this is something that has been an ongoing conversation for the last couple of years with different judges, including the former Chief Justice, Justice Bobde, making quite vocal comments about how they want to sort of take e-courts to the next level and also contemplate using emerging technologies, including machine learning and deep learning. So we came out with this paper, which broadly is not a very deep dive into all the issues, but it is like a primer to both lawyers as well as non-legal people, and tries to touches upon some crucial aspects from an Indian lens. It talks about potential use cases. It talks about some of the challenges that might be there in both in the long term and the short term within the justice system and with respect to the technology that is being designed. And lastly, also proposes some actionable points as like a way forward strategy to the whole thing, including a template for an ethical charter that may be adopted by the judiciary to govern its usage of AI. The one thing that it does is it's predominantly focusing on judges. And what we thought as a good follow-up to that conversation that is happening in the paper is to also discuss how AI is being integrated within the legal industry. Now, this is something that has been a far more rapid trend, like outside of India, particularly in the US and UK. But also, like I believe, like in India, I think like there are a few firms which have been experimenting with some sort of algorithmic tools to help them with basic due diligence work, document inventorying, and other such processes. So with that overarching context, we essentially want to delve into some of the challenges that might be there. Like the overarching fear is that perhaps this kind of technology is going to make lawyers redundant. So one thing that we definitely want to explore is how much truth is there to that rhetoric. Is that just like a hyperbolic expression, or is that actually something that should be concerning all of us as legal practitioners? And that is one thing. The other element is, of course, also, like I think we have Amlan here, who will probably be delving more into that, on what kind of AI, like AI technology is more viable for the legal profession. And lastly, I think like we will be broadly like beyond the opening comments, we will be taking questions from the attendees towards the last 30 minutes of the session. And hopefully this becomes like an interesting and insightful discussion. So with that, I want to introduce the 4 panelists for today evening. We have with us Ms. Poornima Hatti, who is, I'm sorry. Yes, Ms. Poornima Hatti, who is currently leading the dispute resolution team at Samvaad Partners. She also co-heads the employment, the employment law practice from a contentious perspective. She has extensive experience as a litigator, particularly in dispute resolution space, spanning over 18 years, and she has extended her work to cross-border dispute resolution. She also actively works on issues of diversity and inclusion in the workspace, and has also led various initiatives in the pandemic to improve online dispute resolution to ensure access to those who typically do not have the availability of virtual access to courts. And because of her work, she has been recognized and afforded like several laurels as a legal practitioner. She was recognized as one of Asia's top 50 dispute lawyers and India's top 30 dispute lawyers by Asia Legal Business in 2021. And she has consistently for the last 3 years ranked as an A-list Indian lawyer by Indian Business Law Journal. And yes, Ms. Hatti, welcome. We also have Sachin Malhan, who is the co-founder of Agami, an organization that is catalyzing innovation, entrepreneurship, and collaborative action to advance new and improved systems of law and justice. Sachin, I believe, perhaps if there are like any Indian law students from the early 2000s, they would also know him because he was the mastermind behind the law school tutorials, which were these pioneering sessions for aspiring legal students back in the early 2000s. He has also previously co-founded other ventures like Rainmaker, which is a learning and talent platform that ultimately spun off into Vahura and mylaw.net, and Inclusive Planet, a policy and platform venture focused on greater literary access for the visually impaired. Sachin, for his work in technology, media, social impact, and education, was awarded the Inc. Fellowship in 2010. He's a graduate of National Law School, Bangalore, and initially began his career with a short stint in Amarchand Mangaldas in their Mumbai offices. We have also with us Mr. Amlan Mohanty. Amlan currently leads Google's policy planning, analysis, and advocacy efforts in India on privacy, data governance, content policy, platform regulation, and technologies. Sorry? Prior to joining Google, he advised Indian and foreign clients on complex legal and regulatory issues at reputed firms like Trilegal and PLR. He has also assisted senior government officials in developing landmark policies for India. And he holds a degree in arts and law from the National Law School of India University at Bangalore. Finally, we have with us Professor Nigam, who is a professor at the School of Law at BML Munjal University, Gurgaon. Previously, he was a visiting professor at NLS IU Bangalore and an associate professor at Azim Premji University in Bangalore. Professor Nigam holds a DPhil in law from Oxford University and an LLM in taxation law from New York University School of Law. He also taught at DPP University in London for several years, where he led a team of academics in delivering undergraduate programs in jurisprudence and postgraduate programs in commercial law and international taxation law. Professor Nigam taught law at National Law School, taught tax law at National Law School of India University between 2003 and 4. And prior to joining academia, he was an international tax lawyer working in New York, USA. Welcome, everyone. Arghya, I will hand it over to you now to just take the session forward.
Thanks very much, Amin, for that round of introductions. My name is Arghya Sengupta, and I'm the research director at Vidhi, and where Amin is my colleague who works on applied law and technology. So I think Amin has really set the stage by telling us why we are here. And I'll take off from where he left off in saying that when we did this paper together with Professor PPC, Kripabandhu, Shoptoshi, and the others, I think it was a great interdisciplinary collaboration between computer scientists and lawyers to look at problems that the legal ecosystem faces, how those problems can be solved with the use of technology, and where those problems perhaps can't be solved simply by the use of technology. So we are all, as a group of lawyers in a symposium that's otherwise full of computer scientists, we are delighted to be here and to be having this conversation with all of you rather than with all our colleagues who are all lawyers. So I think, first of all, I speak on behalf of the whole panel. I think we are delighted to be here. So a point that was made by the Chief Justice of India when he was releasing that paper is a point that haunted me quite a bit, which is that artificial intelligence is going to supplement and not supplant human decision making. Now, perhaps we all know that somewhere that's not true. Now, we know that this is perhaps said for gaining greater acceptability for artificial intelligence so that people don't worry about the fact that people are going to lose jobs. So today, during the course of this session, I would urge all our panelists also to question this assumption. Anybody following the developments of AI in the law will note that the increased sophistication of e-discovery tools, automated legal advice, contract management, diligence, predictive analysis, and a whole range of other tools means that certain facets of a lawyer's work will certainly become redundant or certainly reduce. To this extent, as an AI will certainly supplant humans. As far as judges are concerned, while that we may be slightly further away, I feel it is only a matter of time before AI-based decisions in routine matters like motor vehicle accident cases or some kinds of tort cases become the default, and human intervention is the exception. This session that we are in today, this panel, is both a stock taking exercise in terms of developments that are taking place within the legal industry in India on the use of AI, as well as ethical questions surrounding what such use might look like. What is the lay of the land in AI in India? Does the sector require some delicate regulation so that AI use is ethical? And if so, what does such regulation look like? So I'll just leave you all with a thought, with all the panelists, with a thought from a generation back when I was sort of a young law student and looking at what was happening with e-courts in the judiciary. So when computers came in, the judiciary in India first rejected them, then purchased them without purchasing any updates, then used them in addition to paper, that is duplicating the work, then started digitizing all paper records, and now in phase 3 wants to go digital first. What if we were to leapfrog some of these steps with the introduction of AI in the legal industry? Will that leave us better off or will that leave us worse off? So with this, I urge our panelists to take this forward. I'll start with Amlan. Amlan, given the fact that you, as in, wear multiple hats, one as a lawyer and also currently a lawyer working with Google, it would be very interesting to hear from you your thoughts on current AI innovation in India, which is suitable for the Indian legal industry, and how it's likely to integrate into the profession. And given the fact that we've got a whole range of computer scientists as attendees, I think it would be very useful for them to also understand as to what kind of AI tools would be most useful for the legal industry. So Amlan, over to you.
Thank you, Argo. Thank you for having me. Real pleasure to be here. I am going to start off with a caveat. I'm obviously not a technologist, as you said. I am a lawyer, but actually one of the most fascinating parts of my job is that I get to spend time with computer scientists and technologists at the cutting edge of some of these innovations you've been talking about. So I'm going to keep, I have a quick 7-slide presentation that I'd like to take all of you through. Keep in mind, I'm coming primarily from the view of a legal practitioner. It's my experience working in law firms as a law student, and even right now at Google, working on legal and policy documentation. How I think some of us can adapt some of these tools that are already in the market. That I think is really what I'd like to talk to you about. So I'm just going to very quickly present a video. Sorry, it's my deck, and I'd love to take questions from you at the end. So I'd like to just start off by talking about what we mean when we're talking about artificial intelligence. And I'd like to make a very subtle but important difference between artificial intelligence and machine learning. What we really should be talking about is machine learning. I think that's where all of the innovation lies. And I'm sure all of the computer scientists in this room are familiar with this. It's not new, but just to put a pin on this, machine learning essentially runs on adaptability, the ability for a machine to learn from new data, from new insights. So it isn't simply about making things smart, but then really leaving that machine to improve upon itself. And I think that just throws open the opportunities for not just the legal industry, but across all sectors to be able to adopt technologies in ways that we can't actually even fathom at the moment. And I really think that's a key takeaway for us is at the end of this presentation, we're going to be left with, I think, more questions than answers. A very simple example of how machine learning is different from traditional ways of how we've worked on software. Spam typically would follow an if-then statement. So if it contains the phrase Viagra, probably spam, send it to the spam folder. With machine learning, it's very different. You're actually trying to classify some emails, obviously based on objective parameters that have been coded in, but essentially giving the tool, the email management system, the ability to learn from patterns and to change its own code to be able to learn and predict things in the future. So you're really essentially leaving it to itself to change itself and to learn from past data and patterns. What I want to spend a little bit of time on is what ML can actually do. So this is the crux of the question you were asking, Arghya, which is what are the tools and techniques that are actually already underway? And I'd like to take a couple of examples from the tech industry, from Google, to talk a little bit about the 4 things I think that really embody what ML does and how we maybe can apply that to the legal sector. Classification is, I think, one of the most foundational things that ML can do. And this isn't limited to what we traditionally used to think about in terms of classifying text, because we're already seeing now, for example, the ability for AI to be able to classify images, right? So you run a machine learning program, it can identify pictures of cats. From 1,000 images, it'll pick the one photo from that has a cat. We're also extending this now to new types of mediums, including sound, right? And obviously, images is something that we've applied. Just give you a very quick example with photos. You'll see now, this isn't unique to Google, but you'll see if you open your Google Photos app, you can actually search for images based on a simple query like boats. Show me all of the photos of boats. Now, this is a significant, I think, development, and you can imagine what the applications could be in different sectors. We're already seeing this in places like healthcare. We're able to identify and detect things like tumors when you give it a sufficient amount of data. But I'll get to questions how perhaps this can apply to the legal sector. But I think classification of image, text, sound is a foundational principle on which I think ML in the legal sector will run. Second is prediction. And Arghya, you mentioned this a little bit. And I think a lot of the FUD in the context of AI and the law rests on this idea of prediction. You don't want to give AI or automation too much leeway in being able to predict things. But I just want to give you a couple of examples of where we think prediction actually has helped in the real world. One good example is this idea of flood alerts. Right? Google, in association with the Ministry of Water Resources, CWC, runs a flood forecasting initiative where we actually source data from the Central Water Commission and are able to build digital elevation maps, DEM maps, with real-world topography, and being able to predict actually where a flood might occur down the line. So this isn't simply historical analysis. This is historical analysis, live data, and running AI tools to be able to predict where a flood alert might hit, the specific region in which that can hit, what the depth and water level might be, and other aspects that might be helpful to users. So this is something that we send to all users on Android phones and other platforms, including Google Search, Google Maps. But really the key insight here is if you have sufficient data, and I think it's important to say that this needs to be authoritative data. So it's really important that this comes from a source like the government of India, and be able to build an engine that's able to take all of this pattern recognition analysis, this historical data, live data, and over a period of time being able to predict what that means. How this should and can apply to the legal sector is something I'll just pick up in a little bit. Generation is, again, one of the newest innovations, because what you're really talking about is taking an input in one form and generating output in a completely different form. So just think about something that we take for granted, something as simple as closed captioning. Right? That's something you're listening to, and you're being able to now create an output in text form. I think what the real future here is going to be is about taking inputs and generating outputs in ways that the two have never interacted with each other. So you take, for example, a video in English, and you're able to, in real time, generate a translation in a different language like Kannada. So it's not English to English, it's English to Kannada. And that's actually input to output in ways that we had never fathomed before. And I think we take a lot of this for granted. So I just really want to take a second to think about how magical this is. And this applies to things like musical melodies, to again, translation. And I think really significant application to the legal industry. The last thing I want to talk about is just an example of how Google Translate works. This is a combination of photo, image, machine learning, translation, and an output in a translated language. Last thing I want to talk about is in terms of language understanding, right? This is NLP, it's natural language processing. Really, I think the future here is being able to speak like you would as a human, right? Just the most natural way in which somebody would talk, and being able to trust your devices to understand what you mean. So it's questions of intent, it's questions of understanding accent, annotation. So it's really about being as natural as you can be and just having the faith that your device will be able to understand you. And obviously, I think the focus in India would be to be able to understand it in multiple local languages. And the Google Assistant, for example, now supports 9 languages. So you can just speak into your phone a voice query, and you'll have responses in the language of your choice. And I think what's really interesting, we've seen from some research, is that most people in India are actually bilingual, if not multilingual. So, in some cases, you might want to search for something in English, but you want your output in another language. And that's really, I think, the future of where NLP stands. So what does all of this mean for the legal industry, right? So Arghya, you mentioned a couple of things which I think were really interesting, but these are, I think, words that are thrown around, right? Smart contracts, contract management, predictive tools. I'm just really looking at this as a layman, as a practitioner. In my time in law school, in my law firm, at Google right now, what would I use these tools for, right? I think it really starts with being able to have some of this information in machine readable text to be able to even improve on it or be able to apply it in some way. So I think digitization is increasingly important as a base activity, but I think classification and translation of legal records is going to be essential. I think if the goal is about making this information accessible to people across India, you can't expect that this is going to be primarily in English. And I think, as I showed earlier, machine learning has reached a stage where you can take a photograph of an English language text and in milliseconds have that translated into a local language and appear in machine readable form where you can then edit and modify it. And I think that's going to be essential for legal practitioners going forward. Arghya, you spoke a little bit about what AI means for the mundane aspects of legal practice. And I think that's where my second point comes into play. I have spent countless hours scrolling website to website, trying to understand where a legal case is at, what the government's thinking is on a particular subject. I think all of that can and should be outsourced. I think those are things that are very monotonous, mundane. And I think AI has reached a point in time where essentially I already do this with some tools. And I'm sure folks like Sachin will be able to talk a little bit about what tools already exist on the market. But being able to extract that information in a way that's relevant and contextual to the reader is where the future of AI is. And I think it can absolutely apply to the legal industry. The third is very closely related to what I spoke about, NLP, is being able to do legal research, but in a conversational way, right? Imagine you just pick up your phone and you ask them queries like you would. What was the last decision that the Supreme Court made with respect to the right to privacy? You're clearly indicating your intent. And I think there are some important caveats there, parameters there around the latest. So there's a time parameter involved. You're specifying it's a Supreme Court, so they know it's a limited search parameter involved in terms of what courts to look for. But I think this can be done, and this isn't as far-fetched an idea as we had earlier imagined. And we're already seeing improvements in this being already integrated in some tools, so I think that's going to be another case. Last thing I think I'd like to talk about is being able to generate data from some of this research. So being able to generate legal briefs and debriefs, I think, again, that's a consequence of NLP and being able to, again, use technologies like GPT-3 to be able to write briefs like a human would, but using an AI tool. And the last thing I think is really what I want to leave all of you with, because when it comes to prediction, I think that's where all of the ethical and regulatory issues come up. When should this be applied? How can this be applied? Who should be applying this? What are the guardrails that we need to have? But I do think there's definitely room for us to be able to, like we did with flood forecasting, provide devices with historical data and being able to understand potential variable outcomes given certain constraints. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
So thanks very much, Amlan. I think that sets the stage very well in terms of thinking about AI or ML and its role as classifiers, generators, translators of within the legal industry and the possible use cases that might emerge. So I'll take this now to Poornima. Poornima, since you work as a senior partner in a law firm, and there are several law firms in India who are actively looking at tools which can aid the day-to-day functioning of their partners and associates, I just wanted to ask you as to what kind of tools do you think what kind of tools are featuring, if there are any at your law firm or other law firms that you know of, and what kind of changes might be needed, particularly thinking of questions around labor law and employment law, to accommodate AI-related tools in the legal industry. Over to you, Poornima.
Thank you, Argo. Thank you, Vidhi, also for organizing this. It's a pleasure to be here. It's always interesting to talk beyond your comfort zone. And I must say right at the outset that I'm not a tech lawyer, and my mainstay is really dispute resolution. So I'm going to approach this topic from the perspective of a practicing court-going lawyer. And that's a perspective that's important simply if we're going to get AI into the Indian legal system. And I think Argo and Amin, you talked about the resistance and how the judiciary has adapted to digitization. Let me tell you an anecdote. About 4 years maybe, the Karnataka High Court decided that we won't have paper lists. For those of you who don't go to court, a list is basically a set of cases that the court will hear the next day. And these are actually physically dropped to offices or for individual lawyers to their homes. My parents who are practicing individual lawyers would get it every night, thrown once the list is out. So reams of paper will be thrown by somebody who cycles or takes a bike and goes from house to house. And when the court said, we're going to do away with the paper list, huge uproar at the bar. As if, we cannot do anything without this physical list being thrown at our doors every night, even when the websites were functioning and you could access digital data. So this is the mindset of a large number of lawyers. And when we talk of lawyers in India, the law firms are only a small part of it. So when we're looking at AI coming into the system, we must address the concerns, the mindsets, and the culture of these large number of lawyers, right? And I just want to put that out there for discussion and understanding, because this bunch of people has not been trained in technology. They're not like you and me and the folks on this panel in terms of access to technology. So I just want to set that, and they're probably the sort of the people who will become judges of tomorrow and work their way into the judiciary, either the lower or the higher judiciary. The second point that I want to make is the demand for the use for artificial intelligence. I do not think that it will supplant lawyers as we know it. And I think 10 years ago, when people spoke of artificial intelligence or machine learning, and what Amlan, you spoke about the use of those specific things within the industry, I think all of those are possible. And I'll come in a bit to what we are doing within Samvaad. But I do not think that this is going to in any way make lawyers obsolete. I think the role of the lawyer will become far more interesting, less sort of filled with drudgery, either in terms of due diligence for corporate or commercial lawyers who are looking at actually going into a transaction. For those of us who litigate, just sheer learning about the predictability of a litigation, or in terms of smaller cases, there would be like 138 or a DRT where the predictability and the ease of access to a tribunal will be far, far easier. But there simply is not enough demand from clients. And if you contrast this to the American system, we're not billing by the hour, much as people would like to think that, large law firms in India may be doing it, but the average lawyer in India does not do it. So, and if you speak to banks and financial institutions or, whoever sends, the client is not here demanding AI. So the demand has to be there for the investment to happen into AI by law firms, right? So whatever investment is happening into law firms in the use of tools is simply happening out of interest, out of being ready for the future, rather than an actual demand being made by clients to invest in that space. The third thing that I want to talk about is, I think as lawyers, in a country where there's a huge backlog of cases, and this has been a problem for a long, long time, and a number of organizations, including Vidhi and Daksh and others, have talked about it, and either it's been caused because of fewer judges, or just the slow pace in administration, or whatever else the problem, the pandemic has accentuated it. I mean, Chief Justice Bobde, as he then was, has said things have gone out of control. The backlog has increased by about 18% across courts. This is without taking into account the fact that people were not filing enough as well. Now, in this context, as lawyers, I think there is a responsibility for us to the larger legal system as officers of the court, if you want to call it that, to make sure that we use AI to integrate it, to make sure that there is a faster disposal of cases. And that demand, of course, exists. There are very few clients who actually ask us, will this get done in a year or so? But, often clients always want to know how long will it take? And almost always they're flabbergasted because we cannot give a definite answer on how long the resolution of a case in court can take. So I think that is there. I'd also like to look at it from the view of the reason to regulate the use of technology by lawyers or within law firms. Both the UK, the US, a little bit in Australia and Singapore, the Bar Council, the Bar Associations are looking at rules to say if lawyers use technology, there has to be responsible use of technology. And of course, there's been much discussion on biases that creep in through the use of technology, and how they focus more to the male white idea as opposed to women or colored or, whoever else we're looking at. So as somebody who's interested in diversity, I think when we build AI, we need to make sure that the Indian equations of gender, caste, disability, and whatever else we want to address are built into that system so that it allows us to move further and look beyond that. So I think these are my opening thoughts. Just what are we doing within our organizations? We have a lot of initial AI built in for basic contracts. So when you look at NDAs, which are non-disclosure agreements, issues on employment contracts, basic employment contracts, we already have machine learning in place where we can generate contracts without even having the youngest lawyer or a fresher out of law school to generate this. We're also able to look at litigation, predictability, and contract analytics, because clients have used this in other jurisdictions and sort of want to do a comparative analysis of contract renewal, breaches, and things like that when you're talking to large international organizations. So these are some things that we've invested in and they're working, but there's, I think, invariably a human in the loop at some point of time, and there's much to grow. But I think this is my initial conversation that I wanted to sort of open up, and happy to take questions as we move along, because I think the perspectives that each of us bring to this table are very, very different. And I just want to sort of bring in a little bit of the reality in terms of how the average Indian lawyer looks at AI. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Poornima. I think that's actually a good reality check, particularly for those from outside the legal fraternity, because sometimes there's this image of lawyers in very natty suits and talking very articulately and presenting their case, and we all know that that's not what a bulk of the legal profession actually looks like, and it's. And so I think it's very important to note that there are real problems with basic technological access, and I think your anecdote about the paper cause list is very illustrative in that regard. So that's the ecosystem in which we are functioning, in which we are having this conversation. So it will be useful to keep that in mind. Though of course all change has to start somewhere. I think this would be a useful segue to take to Nigam, given the fact that as a legal academic, the role of law schools and legal education shape graduates in this changing world is becoming even more critical. Not only is on questions of training in technology or interface with technology, as we've all had courses on the Information Technology Act and so on, but I don't think that's really gotten us very far. But what is it that we need to create a new generation of law students. I know that as Dean of BML Munjal Law School, together with Bahura, as in there was a study that was done in terms of what a new age legal profession looks like. So I'm hoping, Nigam, that you can throw some light, having dealt with students for a vast part of your career, as to what does a new age law student and legal professional look like, and how do we look at integrating artificial intelligence within this education. Over to you.
Thank you, Argo, and I'm delighted to see all the participants in this webinar. In fact, I've seen you over many years, and all of you look pretty much the same. I'm the only one losing hair every time I see you again after many years. But it's great to be here, and I was also delighted to see Argo saying that he belongs to the previous generation. I don't know what that makes me. I think several generations ago, and I think that is a good segue to go into what Argo wanted me to talk about. When I started, I was the founding dean of the BML Munjal Law School, and very soon I'll be heading towards the National Law School, Bangalore. And when I looked at the curriculum, it's BCI mandated curriculum. So most of the law subjects are mandated by the BCI, and definitely the generation that I belong to, we had absolutely no connection. We couldn't envisage a connection between law and technology, which is a pity in some ways, because outside of the National Law School ecosystem, there are several other places where actually there's a possibility of people getting together within the spaces of the university to talk about interactions between different disciplines. So, for example, BML Munjal has a School of Engineering and a School of Management, and they have a School of Law, and there could be, you could see several possibilities taking place there. But in the vast majority of the National Law School network, that is not even a possibility today. There's no other, they're all universities, but they're all actually law universities. They don't have that kind of easy interaction with other schools. So I want to make 4 points here in this kind of introductory talk, and I know we're going to discuss this further. And the first thing I want to say is that I think fundamentally, from a legal educationist point of view, we need to envisage education very differently, not the sort of education that a generation back Argo received and several generations back I received. I think that's not the kind of education that we should be talking about. We should be headed towards, as the new education policy says, we should be headed towards a broad liberal arts-based curriculum. I don't know how many of the people on the panel have actually looked very closely into the new education policy of the government. It's quite far-reaching in many ways, and it actually makes a pretty valid point. We don't know how well it will be implemented in the future, but pretty valid point that this kind of education in silos is no longer possible, and that we will need a holistic education going forward. The BA LLB kind of education that all of us got, which was meant to serve the role of liberal arts in education, now has to be reimagined. And reimagined, first of all, to get the basic sciences into the curriculum, or at least some fundamentals of the basic sciences and technology into the curriculum. I would have loved to have a teacher like Amlan in my classroom, teaching me the difference between AI and machine learning. None of us, I don't think, had that kind of basic understanding of. I mean, his example was machine learning and AI, but a basic understanding of many other fundamental aspects of sciences. I was just reading a book called The Codebreaker, which is on gene biotechnology and gene sciences, and I can't make any sense of it in the first few pages because I just didn't receive kind of broad-based science education in my law course. And I think I'm taking law course as the example, but I think going forward, any kind of education should have some introduction to the basic sciences. So that's my first point. When I say broad-based legal education, I meant that an education that is liberal arts in the broadest sense possible, having some issues of technology and science embedded in it. Now, I'm sure that people on this panel, certainly Amlan, must have gone and read the white paper on Bitcoins by Satoshi. I ask all of you to read it, because no lawyer can understand that white paper, even though it's quite an important feature of cryptocurrencies, because it is full of jargon that can only be understood by computer scientists. But it's an important paper. It's an imaginative leap in understanding how to store data, it's an imaginative leap in banking and finance, right? But in order to understand that leap of faith, we are not able to, we need to grasp certain basic concepts that needs to be taught to students. So that's my first point. The second point is that we must consciously relate the two. So there should be courses on law and technology, including artificial intelligence and machine learning in classrooms. We have courses consciously linking areas already in law school. So we have been taught several generations ago, we were taught law and poverty, law and development, law and human rights, law and environment. Right? And now we need to be taught law and technology and introduce concepts as one that my previous panelists were talking about as part of that technology. My third point is that that's no longer only requirement. I think we must embed technology and technology-related areas in our curriculum, right? So, for example, if we have tort law, we're talking about negligence, issues of negligence when AI is, and some of these issues have already been talked about, I think, by Vidhi as well. Issues of negligence in AI-related activities, driverless cars, etc. If you're talking about evidence, what happens when there's evidence based on someone having trawled through all the WhatsApp messages of a certain person, which has been released to the prosecution and the defense. If you're talking about contract law, Information Technology Act, electronic signatures, but also the newfangled issues that are come up now, which are related to social intermediaries, etc., and which have been in the news recently. And if you're talking about constitutional law, right to privacy, and all the other related issues. I'm trying to jog my memory when I was a student, and I don't think I learned anything about privacy in my constitutional law classes, and I was not privileged to have Argo in my classes teaching this subject either. So these are the kind of interesting areas that the impact of technology that should be embedded in our legal curriculum, and that's the kind of substantive part. But the procedural part of it, in some way, if I can call it procedural, the question about Amlan was talking about the various characteristics of machine learning and various qualities. And one of the things he was talking about is classification, and he said, many things can be digitized. And as you know, land records and other property records in Bangalore and other places badly require digitization, right? And our students can help in that project. Right? The students in law schools can help in that project, and by doing that, they actually learn how technology is changing the way government business is done. Right? So anybody who has ever dealt with the Khata office in Bangalore municipality knows that we badly need a lot of digitization in that area. The other thing is legal research, right? I mean, Poornima was talking about the drudgery of work, and I think our law students, at least my law students, talk about the drudgery of legal research. And I think Amlan was indicating in his conversational search area about how case law queries can be Google type conversation queries, right? What did the Supreme Court say on this? If I ever type, what did the Supreme Court say on this in Manupatra or in Lexis, I think the system will crash, right? So we need a more kind of non-drudgery kind of legal research. And my final point, I don't want to take too much time, is that we need to have both the streams of law and technology in a legal education environment. The one to do with legal practice that Poornima was talking about, and the other to do with policy that the other panelists were talking about. And I think both those streams, the idea, of course, we were talking about due diligence and contract management and processes on the one hand, and that this would include litigation as well. And on the other hand, we also talking about the privacy-related aspects of technology, social intermediaries, fake news. How does artificial intelligence kind of interact with those kind of policy issues as well? And I think both those issues, law schools are just doing catch-up. They're not yet there, and it's something that we need to talk about quite seriously. Thank you. I'll just stop there.
Thanks very much, Nigam. I think since IIT Kharagpur is one of our co-hosts for this symposium, I think there's a wonderful experiment there with the School of Law actually being set up in IIT Kharagpur. And maybe that's a lesson, that's something that we can think about in law schools as to whether, rather than just teach technological subjects, and can we think about having schools of technology so that it can be truly interdisciplinary? As in, the answer to this question is really to set up universities rather than set up specialized schools. But I think that's a question for a longer debate. I'll finally turn to Sachin. Sachin, as in, you wear multiple hats, as in you've worked extensively on the intersection of the increase of data on data-driven tech in the justice system, and particularly as to how to ensure that the justice system remains accessible to the largest number of people, that is the citizens of the country. So I'd like you, Sachin, both wearing your current hat as co-founder of Agami, as well as your previous hats working with law students and as a lawyer, to tell us a little bit about how you think about artificial intelligence in particular, and technology more generally, becoming integrated in a manner that ensures accessibility for those who need it. Over to you, Sachin.
Thanks, Argo. I just wanted to check. I actually have a short presentation. Maybe I can, but before I do that, I think the previous speakers, what they spoke about allows me to focus on a couple of things, because Amlan has sort of laid out the landscape and the possibilities and basically the foundational technologies, right? Like the way he talked about classification, prediction, generation, that kind of tells you where things can go. There's much to be understood in terms of the use cases, but it tells you the foundation of like where we can go, right? And Poornima has touched on some of these use cases and kind of spoken about the fact that they're all very promising, but many could be premature in an Indian environment. We just don't know, right? Like what will pick up and when. And Nigam spoke about, how law schools need to respond. And that really allows me to kind of come to a topic that is, maybe I flogged this horse just way too much, but the point on how do we get there? Because, we always articulate, everything as we should do this. These are the use cases and these are the possibilities. And then we have to ask the question, how do we make the innovation happen? Because the innovation can't be one-off, right? Like it can't be a few startups in the one area, whatever. It needs to become a cultural phenomena. And the question I have for everybody is, how in India do we make AI-driven innovation in law and justice a widespread phenomena? How do we do that? And maybe the good part is we don't need to do it now, but we need to take those steps now. And I wanted to, and while this is a broader debate, because this has a lot to do with what we teach people in law school and how we integrate law school and engineering and data sciences, it has a lot to do with different things when you talk about building the ecosystem, because you're building it not just for one type of innovation, right? You're not just building it for innovation to serve the courts. You're building it for all possible innovation that could serve citizen needs, private and public, and we don't know what that's going to look like. Maybe one day somebody will be able to know whether what is the value of their rural property, or by checking on an app somewhere, and that person will be able to take financing based on that, or I don't know. I mean, the possibilities are massive. So we need to first break out of the categories that are more like we need to take those categories that are possible, the categories of contract automation and legal research, and we need to just zoom out and go, oh my God, like what is possible? Because only when we do that, can we break out of the headspace of the legal practice. See, legal practice serves citizens. Legal practice is not an end in itself. How do we then zoom out to citizens and then see the entire gamut of how innovation in law and justice, driven by AI and ML in large part, can make happen those possibilities? And we have to do that for 1.3 billion people, right? Like, and we have to do that for, as people say, practically 3 countries that live together in one country, right? Like India 1, as some people call it, India 2, which is like 80 million, and India, which is like 1.1 billion. So I think there are some real questions, but they all point to the same thing, right? How do we build this ecosystem? And the ecosystem, and ecosystems have different elements. So I want to just talk a little bit about some of those investments, some of those things that we may need to do to unlock a scale of innovation that right now we can't quantify, but we need to work towards, we need to lay those things in place. So I'll quickly just talk about some of those things. They may touch on ideas that have already been mentioned, but I'll try not to repeat those things. Arghya, you'll have to just let me know the moment you see the screen being shared. Just give me a second.
Yeah, your screen is being shared.
Yeah, can you see that, Arghya, the green?
Yeah, we can see it clearly.
Okay, awesome, great. So, I think the point is we want the fruits of responsible AI for law and justice. And I use this term responsible AI. We want inclusive, responsible, accessible AI. But are we investing in the garden, right? Like that becomes, because that's how you get the fruits. So are we investing in the garden? What does it mean? Like knowledge alone of the possibilities will not be enough to invest in the garden. And the dangers of not investing in the garden are overdependence on external technology, under maturity of local innovation, all of those things, right, that come from not investing in the garden. And some of these examples are like, you start to see and various countries have seen this isolated and inequitable AI initiatives, right? And all of these are coming from, let's just say, law students and lawyers don't understand the AI law interface beyond use cases. So you find someone and they say, yes, contract automation, but understandably, they don't know when the automation is just algorithmic or it's happening through machine learning. Like there's a limit in terms of what they understand. And I think that even in the paper that you put out on the justice system, you've spoken about the black box problem, and so this gets pretty sophisticated, right? Like it can get so sophisticated that even with great literacy, you don't understand actually how the the systems are working. But you can peel it back. You can go back many steps and realize that right now we just don't understand that whole technology law data interface, right? Experts are few and far between. We all know there's a tendency to say, go to the same people, like 4 people, 5 people. And for innovators, it's a huge barrier to entry, because innovators can't just get in and start building towards something. It's currently very challenging. So only the very entitled, you can somehow get access to people and some kind of funding, or the super resilient, you can stay in the game for so long, but you don't have a platform to leap off and create innovations. And I'll come to, and the second line explains some of those things, not all of them, but some of these are because you don't have data essentially, right? And it's already been mentioned, but you don't have, the raw data is hard to access, or definitely there are barriers to access it, and definitely training data, which is labeled data that says this is this in this data, that is even harder to access, because as you start to make the system more accurate, you need then the training data, right? So people are repeatedly scraping and cleaning the same sets of data. And some weeks you come across people who've been working separately on cleaning the same set of data. And it really, you wonder, like, how are we going to, because we need massive amounts of data of all different types. If you want to build a property related thing, you need massive amounts of property related data, records, cases, deeds, all of that. And if you want to build something in, say, municipal related, you need civic data, all of that. If you want to build and of course you have judgments, right? And another problem, which is a very serious problem, is the inadequate middle actors. See, if you look at the world, the places where big innovation has happened is with middle actors, which is either university sees itself not as just a center for research, but a center for active kind of creating of public goods, right? Like we will build public goods. So like ImageNet, which built the largest database of labeled images, which led to what Amlan was talking about, this explosion of innovation in image recognition, was all coming from collaborations by middle actors, universities, and maybe even companies. Now, of course, companies in the US drive it more than the academia, but middle actors, right? Not government, not like a single innocent innovator, someone in the middle saying, we need to build these public goods, right? And of course, below that, inadequate patient capital and lack of sectoral leadership, people willing to catalyze and lead at a sectoral level, not at institutional level only, not at a single product or service, at a sectoral level, right? And if you look, actually flip it and see what you actually need, you start to recognize at the bottom, you need a broad multi-stakeholder commitment to responsible AI, right? At the bottom, multiple people say, India needs to develop innovative, responsible AI for law and justice, which works for 1.3 billion people, not just the institutional stuff like the courts, but actually at the consumer level, at citizen level. You need broad multi-stakeholder commitment. And then you go from there. You need widespread legal literacy, more deep expertise in terms of academic technical policy. You need public goods right in the middle. You need by public goods, we mean resources that are free and openly available for anyone to use. Who's going to develop them, right? Whether it's data, technology benchmarks that say this system works this well, free and open source software, please, who's going to develop them, right? On top of that, the innovators build, because it's very hard for them to do it from scratch. But on the other hand, if you've got free and open source, if you've got public goods that take them 70% of the way, much easier for them to build and kind of come out with solutions in a variety of different areas. The moment you have solved the problem of public goods around, say, property data, you will have an explosion of innovators servicing very different types of people because of that, right? And finally, AI collaborators, right? Which is many different people coming together to solve some of these more complex problems, because which can't be solved individually by innovators, right? Whether it is translations or it is benchmarks in certain areas, collaboratives, right? And you don't need to. The interesting thing is these are not all separate themes. And I think what is going to be really interesting in India is going to be how do we develop public goods in such a way that they hit all those goals. They develop literacy. They, kind of represent collaborations amongst people. They spur innovation. They deepen expertise. Like how do we? And I think creation of public goods in India is going to, in AI for law and justice, going to be a huge opportunity. I want to give you an example of one such collaborative. Right now, it's an open collaborative. Other organizations, many people are actually inputting into this. But you have National Law School's new Center for Technology and Law. You have Step. You have ThoughtWorks. I know Vidhi's given its inputs. Agami is very much involved in the collaborative. And what we're looking at is this issue of machine-driven summarization of judgments and legal briefs, right? Let me just, very simple, the computer summarizing a judgment or a legal brief, like how good can that get? And that's using what Amlan mentioned earlier, natural language processing. And the goal of this project is to develop benchmarks, basically develop tools that do it at a certain quality level and then put it out as a challenge to the ecosystem to say, okay, this level, here is this tool, and can you beat this? Can you get it better than that? And all the underlying data and the tool is available for everyone to build off and get better. And, and I'll give you an example. So if you look right now at the current state of affairs, you have solutions like Legal Pegasus, which can instantly create summaries of judgments. When you train them on Indian data, they get even better, right? If you see that dark green there, you'll realize that, you have the light green is the Legal Pegasus, and the right green is the dark green is the, when you train it on data, it gets better and better. And when it slides to the right, that graph, that histogram, it means that it's getting better and better. Now, this effort to make better machine summaries, it needs a mass collaboration. It cannot be done purely technologically, because the solutions, the NLP solutions, still suffer from something they call hallucinations. literally, right? Like hallucinating. It imagines a fact. It turns a fact. It imagines a core legal issue correlated with the fact that it doesn't exist. Why does it do that? You know, people are still not 100% clear of why this happens. But it opens up this incredible opportunity where you can develop for all of these public goods, hopefully several hundred over the next few years, opportunities for students and young lawyers to actually plug in and say, hey, I found a hallucination. Hey, I'm tagging this data in a certain way. And using our sheer human capital, we can actually check off those boxes of achieving literacy, involving people, developing public goods, spurring innovation. So this is just one example, you know, and next week, actually, we are launching an initiative where to do exactly this, and you're going to be onboarding about 300 students. The invitation is going to be out next week to actually annotate legal texts using these labels and also call out where the hallucinations are. Like, hey, this data, this little conclusion that this technology reached from the summary didn't make sense, and here is the problem. So just, you know, that is the reason why I feel that one way in which we can really make a big leap forward is collaboratively developing public goods in AI and in AI's application in law and justice, because it checks so many boxes, and it's a good way for the system to start moving forward. And unfortunately, we're not so good on the collaboration part, right? If you see that blue dotted line, you'll find that domestic collaborations around AI research have actually been consistently dropping from 2013 to 2019, actually. So we need to be doing a lot more because of the kind of opportunities that they create. I know I'm at time. One last thing I'll mention is, you know, we spoke about this major problem that, you know, our law schools are all, and for good reason, the law schools were all created separately, right? Because we wanted this new experiment and made sense, right? But the implications are that you are constantly, you have a huge wall, right? Like I on Google Maps, I found out that from National Law School in Bangalore to the closest good solid engineering college is a 1 hour, 10-minute walk, and Stanford's computer science department to the law school, 15-minute extremely pleasant walk, right? So how can you have that innovation until these worlds are colliding and colliding frequently, which brings us back to the need for public collaboratives, open public collaboratives where people can work together. So how do we do that? More collaborative open AI projects. One way of doing this, one way of jumpstarting student involvement, moving the whole ecosystem forward. Of course, interdisciplinary studies, we're already seeing more of these clinics coming up, and capital for public goods and innovation. Right now, there's a tremendous dearth of seed capital for AI applications in law and justice. And from the student's point of view, I think what I would say to those of you, you got to do all three things, right? You've got to learn conceptually the courses, you've got to engage, help build data sets, help in these collaborative technology development things, nothing like actually engaging the kind of learning that you get, and create. Even if you create solutions that, don't fly, actually experiment and create, because that is, again, is a really powerful way for you to learn and onboard in a new reality that is intersectional, where it's not enough to say, I have this expertise in law. You really need to know many different things and unlearn and relearn them constantly. Thank you. Back to you, Arghya. I know I can speak more about the use cases, but I'll just I'll wait for that and pick them up in questions. Yeah.
Well, thanks very much, Sachin. I think that's a very nice way to round off these opening remarks, to look at from the perspective of what the building blocks of developing this collaborative ecosystem is. And I hope that this symposium itself is a starting step in that direction, being a collaborative between many technologists and some lawyers. And we have a lot of technologists in the room. So before I hand it to Amin for a couple of moderated questions that he has, I'd just like to ask everyone who has any questions to please type it in the chat box, or I'm not sure what we are running, or ask the question when it's your turn and when we turn to you. And I urge all the panelists to try and answer as many questions in the chat box as possible. So with that, Amin, over to you.
Thanks, Arghya. Yes, you can type it in the Q&A box, which is, I think, appearing for everyone towards the bottom right. And the panelists can either answer them typing, like texting back, or like they can take it subsequently. I just want to quickly circle back to, I want to say that, of course, this is a very interesting discussion. And I think like, as someone who has been sort of reading up a bit more about how like lawyers are thinking about the use of AI, as well as like from a sociological perspective, like a lot of concerns that people have raised in terms of inclusiveness issues or like biases. I think this was a very thought-provoking conversation to begin this whole idea. I want to circle back to the points that I think both Poornima and Amlan had made in their conversations, which was about how some of the more fundamental legal processes, like say you're talking about intelligent research, case analytics, things like that, these can potentially be in like your more immediate use of AI. These could be some things that either are already being transferred to algorithmic processes or could be explored to be transferred to algorithmic processes. My own experience, the little that I have from an actual like litigator's practice, is that these formative years of any lawyer, where you are essentially engaged in a lot of this grunt work, are pivotal to shaping their intuitive understanding of their fields of law. So a question that also sort of surfaced in one of our earlier sessions yesterday was that if you are relying too much on algorithms, is that potentially risking the intuitive understanding of lawyers about the law, especially of younger lawyers or fresh graduates who are joining the profession? I think like at our stage where we have been in the profession for several years, it might not be such a like, it might actually be convenient and efficient. But for someone who's jumping into a field of practice, do you completely want to sort of wean them into this kind of a space where most of their initial research is just coming from like these algorithms which are doing the heavy lifting, and they can just sort of collate it and present it? That was one. And I would definitely want to hear both Amlan and Poornima's thoughts on that.
Amlan, do you want to go first or should I? Thank you. Thanks,
Go
Amin. So I think what cannot be changed is the creativity and the sort of the counseling that a lawyer will give, right? So through AI, I think, and that is something what we've been traditionally trained for and look at. And I think the focus, and I'll defer to Nigam also on this, in terms of training lawyers, should be that creativity, that counseling, and that is what the client is looking for. If we integrate AI and the use of AI through technology as part of the law school curriculum, and when we come out, we're able to read that white paper that Nigam was talking about and understand it, then we're in a position where we could use AI right from the first day of law practice, without having to worry about who's going to do the diligence or who's going to do the contract review, right? So you're looking at an integrated practice, which I don't think there is any need to worry about. It's just a question of training. If you don't have the AI, or if the cost of your lawyers is cheaper than the AI, then yes, of course, you'll throw 100 lawyers at a data room and they will crunch and come up with something, right? But if you have AI and your lawyers will then look at the next level of analysis, whether it's telling them that, look, if this goes into litigation, this is what is going to happen, and therefore do A, B, C, D, which will prevent it or minimize your damages or whatever else you're looking at. So you're looking at a different kind of lawyering, and that should happen. And a more responsible kind of lawyering is what I think will happen. So I don't think there's anything to fear about. It's just the nature of the practice will change. And possibly, your Motor Vehicles Act or your insurance claims will be automated to the extent that the scope for discretion is lesser, and consumer court cases even. But of course, there will be the odd outlier. And I think I want to reiterate that we all have to recognize that the bias and the responsibility that Sachin talked about should be taken care in how you build this AI. And if I may take one more minute to sort of respond to a question that was also raised why should lawyers learn about AI and what we should, I'm just trying to pull up the question. The question is, why should law students learn artificial intelligence, and let the computer science people, really do their job? Lawyers can assist as domain experts. I don't think the idea is that, we should be sort of supplanting or doing what the computer folks do. But I think, we are sort of, if you know enough lawyers, you see that we are afraid of technology sometimes even. And that's, it takes a lot to sort of unlearn. And the pandemic, for instance, has jump-started things simply because people didn't have a choice. But if you see the way even, Bangalore is in lockdown and only very urgent matters are being heard by courts. We have a laptop problem in our lower courts. Our commercial courts don't know how to use Zoom, which is very intuitive. This is 1.5 years into the pandemic, right? So there's clearly, you just don't know how to use technology. I think so. This sort of interface helps. I mean, I've always joked with my husband, who's not a lawyer, who comes from an IIT and INM, about how those guys need a good dose of feminism and political science. So there's different things that you learn with interdisciplinary ideas. So I think there is lots to be said for us to not be scared of technology. So somebody says machine learning, then you're not saying, oh, I'm going to lose my job and run from the situation. So there's a need to familiarize and understand and then say, look, cryptocurrency, I know nothing about it. Please go to ABC only. And there's a few people who know about that, right? So I think that happens with familiarization. Amlan, sorry, I took my time.
Sorry. Amlan, can I just interject once and also just modify my question a bit, taking some elements of what Poornima's response was? So one thing that I'm I think what I probably did not convey very explicitly is, so is there in our understanding of the way we are looking at AI's application in the legal industry currently, okay, there are certain tasks where we can consider AI's use. So for instance, as Poornima mentioned, that the creativity or the creativity of the human cognitive processes cannot be, say, mimicked by an algorithm at this stage. But is it something that cannot be attained? Is this something going into the realm of some super intelligence, or is there something previously attainable which will be algorithmic, with both machine learning and deep learning techniques, where you can sort of also get this kind of intelligent analytics, not just talking about research, but actually sort of giving you that creative element of how you should string your research together to put out a comprehensive advisory brief from a lawyer. So that being the case, are we in a way sort of looking at a space where we want to redline certain areas and say that right now we just want to experiment with a very rudimentary sense of AI, and we can probably use it for case analyses or case research and things like that, but not into advising clients and things like that? And the second element to that is that probably a crude analogy to this would be that when Google Maps first came, the data set was not great, and it has evolved into a product which today has extensive coverage and can particularly find routes anywhere practically across the globe. And the downside of that arguably would be that human beings are too reliant on this technology, to the point that I know this is a bit of a crude analogy to draw, but that is where I'm sort of venturing into when I'm saying that, does it dim your intuition as a lawyer if you rely too much on this kind of smart analytics and potentially smart legal brief designing algorithms?
Sure. No, thanks, Amin, for those questions. Yeah, on your first question, I agree with Poornima, and I actually think we should not romanticize that grunt work. I think, and I'd love to hear Professor Nigam on this, but I think a lot of that burden should be shifted to the legal education part of someone's career. I think I was just actually doing an interview with Bahura as part of how legal curriculum should be improved to adapt to changing trends, and I told them, I have seen interns at law firms, for example, not fully able to even leverage Google search, the search engine, that you're still struggling with, for example, search filters. Those are things that you need to have learned in law school, right? Because I think what you want to come into legal practice knowing is how to already have curated information, to have collected that information, arranged that information in a comprehensible, intelligible way, right? Because what you're being paid to do in terms of legal practice is what you just said, is the analysis, is the insight, right? So I think the first part of that is how can we outsource all of that work to the legal education and to AI tools. So if it's a question of monitoring the legal and policy landscape, all of that should be done by AI. I don't think there's any benefit at all in having someone actually crawl 30 websites to be able to know what's happening on a particular legal case, because that's what search engines were created for, right? And we just need to move up that value chain where all forms of curation, aggregation are completely outsourced. Now, then you ask the question about analysis, right? And actually, that's the more trickier line, because I totally agree with Poornima. Clients are paying you for a recommendation based on instinct, based on intuition. Can AI replace that? Probably, and that's why in my presentation I left the point on predictive analysis. That is the possibility. That is the future. That is the hypothetical that everyone's grappling with. Is can you replace a legal professional in terms of the recommendation they would give to a client based on historical analysis? We could get there, right? But I still think there's going to be room for human intervention, because what you're going to have is inaccurate data points serving into that recommendation. You're going to have insufficient historical context. You're going to have, as Poornima was mentioning, inefficient and inadequate social context, right? And I think those are things that a human lawyer will be able to provide in a way that an AI tool cannot. So I think the short answer is, how can we automate and outsource all of the tasks that you're calling grunt work, which I think law students should be learning in law school. And when you get into legal practice, you should be doing the analysis and insight, but bringing in human elements, right, of understanding of interpersonal relationships, of intersectionality, of social relationships, which I don't think an AI understands. On your second question, I don't have a very good answer at this point. I mean, it's an evolving process, as Sachin was also saying. We'll just wait and watch as data improves what new possibilities arise. So I'll just I'll deflect on that question. The third question I just want to quickly pick up, that was in the Q&A on the same question, Poornima, you answered, like, why should lawyers learn AI? I think it's because all legal questions are questions of technology in a society where technology is embedded into everything. So if you are going to try and answer a legal question, you actually have to understand the underlying technology. So the example of automated, self-driving cars, and there's an accident, what do you do? To be able to answer that legal question, you have to understand how the technology works. You have to understand how, for example, classification, generation, the AI tool was built. You have to understand the entire process chain, who built what. You have to understand the fault in the system to be able to provide a legal analysis and legal recommendation. So I think that's the way that I would answer the question of why lawyers should study AI.
Sorry, I mean, if I could just come in, just segueing from what Amlan and Poornima was saying, a thought struck me as to who is our audience and who are we building this for? Because a lot of times when we do talk about AI, and Sachin's presentation just mentioned this, there's often an implicit assumption that we are talking about the top 1% or 2% of the legal industry which is going to use it. And I'm not talking about judges, I'm just talking about the legal industry at this point of time. So I was wondering, that's all kind of what we're talking about in terms of the use cases and what we're going to build and where it's useful, is really in some sense the supply side. Now, as far as the demand side is concerned, and Sachin, you had a part in your slide which is talking about building AI literacy and collaborations to build AI literacy, because again, this is not something that lawyers can do themselves, that try and get other lawyers to be technologically literate so that they don't go up in arms the next time the court decides that it's going to do away with paper, or it decides that it's going to move to virtual courts. So I think there's a responsibility there as well, and possibly room for collaboration between technologists as well as lawyers to try and see as to how there can be collaborations in that space. So I was wondering particularly to Sachin and to Nigam as to what possible collaborations can there be between technologists and lawyers on the demand side in terms of making sure that these innovations are not limited to the 1%, but they can truly scale. And to truly scale, it means going to those lawyers who are actually protesting when paper cause lists are done away with. So I thought it would be useful to hear from the both of you on this issue. Sachin, you want to go first?
Nigam, you want to go?
No, I was just going to say that when I heard you saying public goods and how law schools can participate in that, I was curious to know what kind of examples you had in mind. I mean, the kind of examples I had in mind was something I'd alluded to earlier. I think the whole property tax payment system in many of our cities can easily take the benefit of AI, and that will be a public good. But I thought maybe perhaps you had other examples.
No, I think this is really, and this links to what Amlan just said about when technology is coding all the behaviors that are important to analyze from a legal point of view, then you need to know technology, right? Like, I think he made a point that we must understand deeply, which is, and the danger is when you're dealing with proprietary systems, beyond the point they don't want to expose you to the technology, the underlying technology. So what happens is, and we know this problem, right? Like, I think like even in the note that was prepared by Vidhi on the note that was done in collaboration with IIT, that made this point that we don't, like, across the world there is a problem. And I think I alluded to the example with Compass or one of those systems in the US, where beyond the point you don't know what is happening. So actually the question really becomes difficult, because if there is a question of legal determination inside that system, how are you going to understand? So I think the reason I make this point, Nigam, and by public goods, because the advantage of free and open source software, or at least alternatives that are open with data sets that are open, is you actually have much greater, you can actually advance a legal and justice future that is truly literate, because you can see inside those systems. You can see inside those data sets. So, which is why when sometimes people say, but what's the big deal? Why do you need that? Some other companies already created this or this part or whatever. But the problem is, especially for law and justice, it is crippling, because the question will become, how deep do I need to look inside the system to know, what is happening? When is the property when is some relationship being transacted inside the system? How are you weighting this versus that? The ethical issue that Amlan brought up in self-driving cars or whatever, right? So it is so interesting, because it's not just about access, it's not just about cost of innovation, it is actually about the practice, about determination of legal issues. Because over a period of time, everything will become coded in the technology. Now, when you go on your point about the kind of examples, one thing I've seen, and I've seen this with ODR, and Poornima would have visibility in this as well. When you create innovations that also engage the legacy communities and create opportunities, rather than kind of getting into a binary that, you're going to get knocked out, whatever, you just literally roll out something that can be an opportunity. You start to acquire some momentum, and you start to acquire champions inside those legacy communities that may otherwise resist. So I really feel like one huge opportunity of these open collaborative projects is, tomorrow, if hundreds and thousands of lawyers participate in checking something or creating some database or whatever, over a period of time, you start to, kind of eat away at the fears, you start to eat away at the sense of lack of control. So you need to make it, you can't just land up and say, here. You have to almost create these participation pathways. That is and there's something that can be done. I mean, at the end of the day, even ImageNet was like, I think it's, some of you can correct me, I think 80% of the people who actually labeled those images were in India, Amlan, through Mechanical Turk, right? They were using and they're pushing into India. So why can't we, as a part of our 5-year project, make sure that hundreds and thousands of lawyers participate in developing the critical public goods for AI and law and justice? Why can't they label property related stuff? Why can't they point out hallucinations in something? Why can't, like, maybe it's idealized, but at least that is a better approach than kind of an isolated 2 people working on something and pushing it out. So just let's be mindful of that, because I think that's better than trying to convince someone that something is good,
Great. I think that the other panelists, if they have any questions, then they can, I know you can't type it in the Q&A box, but please do unmute yourselves and ask any questions that you might have. And to Sachin, I mean, and that's the other organizers, and to Sachin and Nigam and Poornima, Amlan, there are some 6 questions, so please do try and take them as possible. Amin, back to you.
Argo, sorry, can I just add or respond to Sachin?
Yes, please.
Just quickly.
Yes.
Okay. So one issue, of course, is any of this kind of public goods initiatives, either coming out of law schools or out of NGOs, have to have a government buy-in. That's very crucial, and that's where things may get a bit tricky. So I think, Poornima's example is scalable to any kind of initiative of a public good. Right? So it could be that property tax overhaul will run into major issues with the bureaucracy. So that's something we should be mindful of. I think there's a whole lot of hurdles to cross when it comes to going beyond the 1%. I mean, the 1% who benefit are willing participants in the application of AI. But the moment you go beyond that and you go towards participation that has a public good element to it, you run into issues of bureaucratic inertia.
Ashutosh, do you want to?
Yeah, so just want to add a few things there. I mean, I kind of agree with what Sachin was saying. And so I was just wondering, and this is also what one of the speakers during SAIL said, is that why can't we make this annotation as a part of the curriculum itself? So during law schools, I mean, when students might be learning some new concepts or new things, basically. So as an exercise or as an assignment, they might be required to annotate some legal cases, or maybe, like, for example, create case summaries, or, I mean, so that, I mean, this can be scaled up quite a bit, right? I mean, we have a lot of law schools and a lot of students there. So, I mean, what prevents us from having this? I mean, this also, in a way, also kind of including AI education into the law, legal education. So what, I mean, this is a question for all the lawyers that are there in the panel. So what prevents us from doing this, basically?
Nigam, do you want to take that?
Can be done, should be done.
Okay.
So
yeah, that's.
I think if I were in a position to do it, I'll do it.
Yeah. So maybe I guess you're joining Bangalore soon, so maybe you should. And I'll contact you for the data for sure.
Yeah, I think there are no regulatory roadblocks for doing it. Certainly, as in, if you want to do it, as in, you can certainly do it. As in, I think.
Yeah, because, like, see, I mean, what happens, like, we in computer science, so I am always struggling, especially with the legal data. The biggest challenge is like annotations and finding legal data, right? And if I ask like some layman to annotate, that's not possible. We need some legal and people who have legal knowledge and legal expertise, right? So it's like, for example, you cannot have Amazon Mechanical Turk for this task, like for what you had in.
Can be done. I mean, this is something that can be done. I think it will require training, of course, but it can be done.
Yes, and I think there can be certain incentive mechanism which will also, I mean, motivate students to do it, right? I mean,
incentive could be grades, I think.
Yeah, grades, or maybe or maybe some kind of like a student job or something.
Yeah, sure. I think it can be structured. Yeah, Amin, sorry.
So I also just had a quick question, like just to pick some more brains from everyone here. Particularly Poornima, do you think there are like perhaps like within law firms like certain practice areas which may be more amenable to initial use and piloting of AI algorithms, like and certain areas which you should definitely not be introducing initially?
I think most areas of commercial law would be amenable. I would hesitate to go towards public law, whether that is criminal or constitutional law, simply because the rights are more public, whereas private adjudication, or real estate, contracts, company law, I think all of these are malleable, even if it's transactional or litigation sort of view of that. And of course, you're looking at a certain set of defined rights between a certain set of people, and that's something that I think would definitely be a place to start and start looking at it more closely and as it evolves. I would hesitate, and I was just trying to answer a question on the issues of public law, and the question there was, AI for judges, and how do you look at it from that perspective? I think wherever there is a larger role for discretion and creativity and interpretations, at least where I stand currently on AI, and that's not much, as I said right at the beginning, I would see it difficult for AI to completely stand in the feet of judges. But if you sort of say, I believe in Tisazari in Delhi, there are arbitrators who sit down and have arbitration sittings on phone bill disputes, right? Your Airtel will tell you, or whoever your phone provider will tell you, this is 1,000 rupees, and you're saying, no, it's 500 rupees. That kind of adjudication, I'm sure, can be very well replaced by AI. There's very little room for discretion. There must be some basis by somebody saying it's 1,000 rupees and somebody else saying it's 500 rupees. Traffic rule, whether it's captured on camera and you have to go to the small courts and plead whether you're guilty and actually put a fine. And I think, Sachin, what you were saying about access and public good, it sort of was resonating there, because often people say, yes, I have jumped that red light, I know, I just want to pay that 100 rupees and get on with my life, but they just don't know how to get there and find the lawyer, and the cost of finding a lawyer is probably much more than the 100 rupees fine that they want to pay, and they don't want to take 2 hours off their job to actually go there and tell a judge, wait in line. That means half the day gone. But if you sort of apply AI, possibly then all of these issues could be surmounted. So some parts are probably easier to do and some not so easy.
Yeah, and I think, Poornima, just to take an audience question from Nikhil, which is that what are the incentives for law firms to adopt these AI solutions? And is it that if law firms keep largely offering fixed fee billing arrangements, that they're not incentivized to take up these tech solutions? So could you just quickly, if you'd want to take that?
I think all law firms are interested in a certain in good client service and quick and efficient client service. Of course, answering what we think is the right answer to that question or law or whatever that issue is, right? So if AI helps in getting there faster and more efficiently, that is incentive enough. Of course, the cost of that AI should fit in within the larger budget, as I've said. If I can hire 10 lawyers at lesser cost than what I would invest in AI over a period of time, then I would not invest in AI. So I think if AI would help me achieve that faster, then I would most definitely invest in it and look at it from that perspective. Whether AI would give me a better answer as opposed to using individual lawyers, I'm not sure about that yet. There's been a lot of discussion about the errors on a Friday evening or lawyers working over the weekend. But I think those are sort of fringe cases. I mean, that kind of error can creep in even with data reading and machine learning. So, but I think efficiency costs would be really looking at providing client service.
Great. And there were a couple of questions around the regulatory frameworks and also about data protection laws. And I think, yes, of course, as India needs a data protection law, and certainly that goes without saying, and not just for AI, but for other emerging technologies, what you can or cannot use with the data. And as far as regulatory frameworks, to the lady who asked the question, I think there's a good conversation going in India about responsible AI and the charter that we need for responsible users of AI. So I think there's already that conversation that has begun, and it's great because it's begun in tandem with the growth of AI in the justice sector. So that's super. So Sachin, I see your hand up. Quickly, would you like to add something before we close?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to not pertaining to the regulation piece, but just wanted to share one interesting reflection, which is that we have a lot of people who come to Agami and are working on some solution, and there is a tendency to look at AI and law, and they usually come and say stuff like, could law firms do with a better contract management system or a better legal research? And I would say out of 100 people who come, 95 are somehow oriented towards such a small percentage, like you said, of the country. And there is such a massive opportunity in AI-driven innovation for the country as a whole. There's so many use cases. So I just want to share that because there's this fixation on like 5 or 6 use cases, which, and as Poornima is saying, I'm not even sure are proven out and how long they will be. And people have spent years trying to service those use cases. And the law firms aren't buying my legal research solution. They are not appreciating the semantic search over the keyword search. But the point is, somehow we are not seeing the full range of use cases that are possible. And I understand why, because we are worried about business models and stuff. But I just wanted to mention that because it's to all youngsters out there, all people keen to innovate, there is a world out there. And the range of possibilities is massive. So if we can just reorient, I think it will be good for us,
I think that's a great positive note to end this on, that I think there is really a world of opportunity out there. I don't even think we've scratched the top of the surface. And I think technology solutions are here to stay. And it's not a question of whether to adopt it or not, but how to do it responsibly in a way in which that we can truly maximize its benefits. So I think with that, we can bring this to a close. We were talking about use cases. There's a very interesting use case on use of AI in electronic discovery. There's a session on that, which is the next session in SAIL at 7 o'clock today, where Maura Grossman is speaking about how we can use AI in e-discovery. It's certainly something that's interesting for lawyers to know. And there are several very interesting sessions that have gone on in SAIL and continue. So thank you very much to the panel, to Poornima, to Sachin, to Amlan, to Nigam, and to Amin for putting this all together. I think this was a good conversation about where we've come so far, which is not very far, and where we've got to go, which is we've got a long journey to take. So thank you very much. And thank you very much to the organizers of SAIL, the whole steering committee led by Professor PPC and all his colleagues for putting this together. It's a really wonderful conference. And I can say this on behalf of all the lawyers, since we are all lawyers on this panel, that it's been a real delight to be part of a conference where we are not speaking to members of our fraternity and